You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Every day we are getting closer and closer to Christmas, and of course that is beginning to dominate our conversations, not just here on the radio, but in our business and also in our personal lives. And so the other day I was on the phone with TBR editor Paul Angel, and we were talking about Christmas and some Christmas articles for the magazine, an article that I was trying to write and just have not really been able to put on paper the way I would like to. And that has ended up being our show today on TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. Paul and I are going to talk about Christmas, particularly Christmas traditions, where they came from, how they got here, and how, as the years have progressed, we have seen the secular traditions of Christmas overtake the sacred traditions of Christmas. And so it's going to be quite an interesting conversation, and I encourage you to stay tuned. I think you'll enjoy this week's episode of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. You and I had been talking about an article that I had kind of wanted to write and never, like every time I would sit down to write the article, you know, I'd get a couple sentences down and it didn't seem to flow. You know, some of the research is there, some of the research is yet to be done, and we were talking, and to some degree, I think you may have already written at least 3/4 of the article, you know, a number of years ago in TBR. And so if anything, I guess if I did write anything, I'd just be building on your work now. You know, how the death of Christmas has come about. The truth is that Christmas is so far removed from what it is supposed to be. How in the world did that happen? I mean, you know, I guess,
exactly.
You know, some people say that the small seeds of whatever are sown at the beginning of something. You know, maybe the seeds of Christmas's destruction were actually sown at the origination of the holiday.
The history of Christmas and St. Nicholas and how it started and why they picked that time of year and where all of our little traditions came from. Stockings and Santa Claus and all this stuff is just based in pagan tradition. We'll just talk about the evolution of the Santa Claus myth and Christianity in general, where it came from. And then it's interesting, by the way, that, 17th to 25th was the Kalends celebration in ancient Rome. Oh, I would think Christianity was legal, but people didn't celebrate it openly anyway. They just celebrated Christmas and the birth of Jesus in their own homes, But that particular time of year for the pagans was a gift-giving time. They were spending up their money. As a matter of fact, I forget one of the famous historians at the time said, this is like the best time of year. Like all the shops love it. People are coming in buying gifts and tons of money. So it even started way back then, the idea of that time of year being a big retail time.
Well, yes, sir. I'll tell you what kind of inspired the whole thing was, if you remember the country and western group Kinky Friedman and the Texas Jew Boys. Kinky Friedman, ran for governor of Texas back, I think around 2005, 2006. Willie Nelson was his running mate. Came close enough to force a recount there against Rick Perry. And, there's part of me that thinks that recount was rigged, because how could Willie Nelson lose an election in Texas? But Kinky used to say that we Jews believe it was Santa Claus that killed Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And so I wondered, well, maybe there's something to that. You look into it, and the Santa Claus configuration as we know him today was designed by a guy named Harold Sundblom. Now, forgive me, maybe this is a little racist, but that name sounds Jewish to me. So I thought, well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe there's been. People talk about Jewish conspiracies in government and in finance. Maybe there was a Jewish conspiracy to kill Christmas. That said, I've not really found the evidence for it, but I've often wondered if, maybe it was there.
I think that you're correct. No doubt that the ultimate goal would be to get people to forget about Jesus. Christmas management is one of my favorite holidays. I just love Christmas, but you can never, being raised as a Christian, we have to be troubled by what's happened to the celebration of the birth of Christ. And we can discuss that a little bit later about the commercialization and everything else. But in general, as I encourage people this Christmas, as we look around our homes, to try to be aware of where all the symbolism came from that we see. And we'll go through some of these one at a time. The evolution of Santa Claus, how he started, how different he is from country to country, how he became more popular than Jesus at some point in time. And as Santa Claus, being raised in a Christian family, and I always say my mother was a parish secretary for 25 years at our local Episcopalian church. She really didn't like Santa Claus too much. Santa Claus was stealing Jesus' birthday. Children were thinking that Christmas was all about gifts, receiving and not giving, although children normally don't go out and buy too many gifts, but as long as they're thinking about it, but where did all this stuff come from? I mean, how did first of all, Christianity catch on so well in places that had been for so long a time pagan? And then how did Santa Claus start a strange character who really takes the cultural affinities of the many nations that he goes to? So I guess the first thing we should start with is the birth of Christ. Of course, some of the things we all know about there is that he was born in Bethlehem, right? And the product of a virgin birth. And that immediately it was obvious that he was a special child. And some of the symbolism that we incorporate into our Christian lore is designed to reinforce the premonitions, the predictions of the arrival of Jesus. And for instance, we know that some of the things about Christmas are not correct. Let me talk about that first. December 25 would have been a very unlikely time for his actual birth. We look at the scripture, right, and you'll be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but it says that in the I forget which one of the Gospels it was, that they were keeping their flocks out by night. All right, the shepherds were watching their flocks by night. Well, they probably wouldn't have been watching their flocks by night in December 25th, even in the Holy Land, because it's pretty chilly. More likely, they would have, stabled these animals in the cold weather, and therefore, if shepherds are out watching their flocks by night, this has to be a different time of year. So why did we pick December 25? Well, December 25.
Historians have kind of determined that the census that Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem for had taken place in August. So,
well, there you go.
Yeah.
And so why did they end up locking on to December 25th? Well, we all know that December 21 is a very important date for many, many thousands of years, because this is the date when the days it's the shortest day of the year. And after that date, the amount of sunlight in a day, the days themselves are always only 24 hours, but the amount of sunlight was beginning to get longer and longer. Of course, the diminution every year, the diminution of the amount of daylight was fearful to the ancient peoples, because they were wondering if this would continue on until there was no more sunlight. So I imagine the priests got involved and they understood the astronomy of the whole thing. And it was a very symbolic time of year, obviously. This is the time when darkness is defeated and light begins to emerge victorious. So it's very symbolic. Of course, the ancients also used these equinoxes and the solstices as a time to gauge their crop planting and other things. But this was a very important time. It also would slowly but surely start to warm up. And then it's symbols of rebirth and regeneration, which is very much tied into the lore, to the teachings of Christianity and the relationship to the mission of Christ, which was rose from the dead inevitably, much as the sun would have emerged victorious over darkness at that particular time of year. And of course, Christianity was outlawed for quite some time, as we know, and Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, but the Roman pagans had their own tradition. We'll talk about them for a moment. And one of their big holiday festivals was sometime around the 17th to 25th of the month we call December now. And this was a time of revelry, orgies, prancing around the streets, singing and dancing, but also of gift giving. And so, Christianity is an amazingly versatile religion. And I think it's good in some respects. We see other religions who impose their will on the converts to the point where any not following the tenets of the religion for this or that were local customs were struck down and persecuted. However, Christianity was willing to go to these pagan areas which were worshiping multiple deities and allow them perhaps to continue on with some of the celebrations they had. Look, you can have your Kalend, your Saturnalia festivals, but there will be no more blood sacrifice and there will be no more orgies. The gift giving you can keep, they would say. For instance, one of the things that we all do at Christmas time is to put up evergreen wreaths. Once again, evergreen wreaths were a mystery to the ancients. Here was something, a plant that could stay green throughout the freezing cold weather. And it, too, had unique properties, holly and hemlock, et cetera, et cetera. It was very interesting to them that they could live through the most horrible times of the year. Again, symbols of regeneration, rebirth, and longevity. Of course, during Kalends, the Romans used to put up evergreens all over the areas that they were celebrating in, and they would also put candles in there, and they would have lighted greens. So this is a very ancient a practice that was slowly but surely adopted into ancient European cultures. And so it kind of, and by the way, the Celts used to, when they had many of their pagan festivals out in the open woods, they were great nature worshipers. Of course, they worshiped the oak and the birch as well as holly and evergreens. They would also decorate trees. They would hang little effigies up in the trees and decorate a portion of the forest. So it's quite related to our own bringing of a evergreen tree into the house in the midst of winter to celebrate this miraculous plant. Also decorate our trees. Of course, it slowly but surely changes as we go through time. But we look at some of our other myths and legends surrounding Jesus, and a lot of this is symbolic, and maybe people can take it literally, but there is deep symbolism behind this. For instance, as we said, when Jesus was born, it was pretty obvious he was a miraculous child. I mean, even at a very young age, not when he was a baby, he was preaching and understood the Torah, I guess it was, better than many of the rabbis at the time. And so at a very young age, he was preaching. But even at that time, we Christians incorporated kind of a universal recognition of Jesus as a special being by having outside groups recognize his divinity, and these would be the Magi. We think of the Magi, they're generally portrayed today as one black, one white, and one Asian. That's very nice, and it does relate to the universal acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah or a Savior. But also the gifts that they brought were very symbolic. Now, of course, these magi, related to the word magician or astrologers, probably came from Persia. The Persians had a long history of Mithraism, by the way, and the life of Mithra and the lore surrounding Mithra relates very closely to the life of Jesus, a virgin birth, etc. But so by the way, the skies at the time were extremely important to the astrologers, and this is what got Herod so fired up, because his astrologers were telling him that the way the heavens were, that the big planet guy was being pushed out right of the heavens by another one, and a new leader was coming, and this, of course, he was going to be the real king of the Jews, and this got Herod very worried, which is why he ended up ordering the slaughter of the children, right? So that of a certain age, so that any possibility that Jesus was one of these kids, he would be killed, and then he would be safe in his own kingship, we'll say. But the gifts that the wise men brought were very symbolic as well. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold, of course, is a symbol of the right to rule, right? A king's crown is made of gold, and his vestments. So this is kind of symbolic of Jesus' right to rule on this planet, on the earthly realm. Frankincense is an incense that's burned in church, of course, originally in large censers in the cathedrals, et cetera, but mostly, as I've mentioned one time before, and I think it's a show we did, that cathedrals were kind of stinky because all these unwashed peasants would come in, sit in the middle. There weren't pews, there were just hay. So they were, burning incense to kind of make the place smell better, of course. And of course, this incense, though, symbolically wafts up to the heavens, and it's kind of a symbol of Jesus's right to rule in heaven. So gold for his right to rule on earth, and incense is a symbol of his right to rule in heaven. Of course, myrrh is the ancient embalming, I would say fluid, but it's a resin in which many dead corpses were covered to mask the smell, but also help in the preservation. And this is kind of a symbol over his victory over death. So as we look through these things, we always want, frankincense, gold, and myrrh. Every single thing in the Christmas legend has some extremely symbolic tie to the past, whether it's Christian or pagan. And of course, now Christianity caught on, in 200 or 100 AD, I suppose. And by 300 AD, we had large enclaves of amazing, people forget how widespread Christianity was in the Mideast. Now that we think it's all Muslim, and we're alleged that we are the ones who took this land from the Muslims weren't even around till 600 AD. So this first period of time from say 0 or 100, there really isn't a year 0, by the way. It's 1 to about 600. The Christianity in the Mideast was massive. You had massive communities in Anatolia, which was then Asia Minor, right? You had the Syrian church, you had the Coptic church, you had the Egyptian church, you had it spread all over the place. Of course, these slowly but surely over the last several thousand years, these enclaves of Christianity have been overtaken by the Muslims. So here we have Asia Minor, and there was around 270 AD, I believe it was. It had to have been 270 AD. A saint was born in Myra, and the bishop of inevitably became he wasn't born in Myra, he was born in a seaside town, but Myra as well was a seaside town. But this was Saint Nicholas, and Saint Nicholas was a beloved saint, again born in what is now Turkey. And he was allegedly a miracle worker and a patron saint of repentant thieves and also pawnbrokers, sailors, et cetera, et cetera. And he was very popular. Of course, there are many legends associated with miraculous legends with the history of St. Nicholas. And one of the things St. Nicholas is famous for doing as a young man was to save 3 young ladies, a member of a family who didn't have dowries. They were too poor, so they weren't going to be able to get married if you didn't have a dowry. So they were going to probably be forced into prostitution. St. Nicholas is popping down the street. He looks in, he sees the girls crying. He decides he's going to fix this, and he throws in 3 bags of gold through the window one night when no one's looking, and they land in the stockings hung in front of the socks, whatever they wore at the time of their foot covering. 3 bags of gold landed in the stockings, and here we have kind of the beginning of our myth of hanging stockings in front of the fireplace in which gifts or candy are placed. So St. Nicholas was quite a guy. It was a tumultuous time with the change of the Roman emperors, and he was locked up for a period of time, but released when another Christian emperor came along. And of course, we ask ourselves, well, Santa Claus wears red. Why would he wear red? Red's a danger color, Well, it's his ecclesiastical vestments were red because are red now, even though he's completely unrelated to a bishop or a Christian official. But back then, the bishops were red, so that kind of stuck through the legend. And as we move on, he gets more popular and more popular. His days are celebrated on different times, but basically always in December. December 6th is I believe it was the day of his death, and that was celebrated. Eastern Orthodox also celebrates St. Nicholas Day, I believe, in January, right? January 6th. But we associated him with that very popular time of the year, with Christmas time, and they have stuck the date of December 25 on him, the last day of the Kalen festivals. As time wore on and Christians took their message from the Middle East to Europe, who they thought at the time were such barbarians and so unsophisticated that they would never become good Christians. There were just too many, they were too rough, they were involved in wars and sacrifices and everything else. But they found out that Europe was a perfect place for Christianity. But they had a problem, and that was the long tradition of pagan celebration, rites that accompanied their own strange gods, right? So as they came along, they had different areas with different cultural traditions related to that time of the year, that solstice time of the year. The Scandinavians, for instance, are interesting. They have a long history, of course, of their own pagan gods, Odin and Thor, et cetera, a very rich and colorful group of gods. But to get the Scandinavians to accept this more easily, of course, there's a lot of similarities between Odin and St. Nicholas. They're fearsome characters to some degree. Obviously, Santa Claus isn't just always the nice guy, right? He brings the coal, he brings the switches, and so he could have a sinister, I would say, or threatening side, as did Odin. And Odin, of course, remember, he knew everything that was happening all across the world, because his messengers, the crows, would fly across and tell him all this stuff. And remember that Santa Claus knows he knows when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake, he knows if you've been bad or good. That's very much related to the omniscience of Odin. Now, interestingly, as you go from country to country in Europe, it's all a little bit different. But back to Scandinavia then, Santa Claus also bears a lot of resemblance to Thor. Thor was the god of thunder, but he was also the god who flew through the sky during the day, right? He had bright red hair, allegedly, like the sun. But what he flew was interesting. It was a four-wheeled wagon drawn by goats. And if you know anything about some of the way the different European nations and the peoples there celebrate Christmas, you'll see that Santa Claus dressed much more like the Father Christmas idea we have, with a long robe and perhaps a wreath of holly around his head and a bag of toys. Would be related. How in the world did he get related to the goats? Why is he being drawn by goats? Well, obviously this is one of these cultural things that the Norse people said, well, we already got a guy who flies through the sky and brings sunlight and rejuvenation. And, if we just put Santa Claus have his wagon drawn by goats, our people might like it better. So kind of a thing. But, the Northern Europeans have a long history with the goat. It's an interesting thing as you go through Christmas lore to see the number of countries, specifically in Scandinavia, that have goat motifs. Well, the Europeans have long thought that there were things living in the woods that were goat-like, right? We're talking about Lucifer. Today is a goat character that's in the woods. At the time, way back in Finland, which is it can be called Scandinavia, I suppose, but they're a little different culturally. But if you see what their time of the year was, Finns dress up in goat skins they put big horns on their heads. And this pagan ritual has kind of become synonymous with Christmas for them. And interesting, the Finnish word for Santa Claus is Juhlapuki. Okay, I think I'm saying that right, Juhlapuki. And that actually translates into Yule goat. So, of course, the Scandinavian pagans had a goat, it might have been the Teutonic, called Geiter. He was the goat god and lived in the woods. And of course, we see this half man, half goat thing going all the way back to Roman times and Greek times with Pan. And so, once again, Christianity encounters a strong tradition. They want you to become Christians. If you want to keep a portion of your own belief system and incorporate it into it in your own local traditions for celebration of Christmas, as long as Jesus is the center of this thing, and we understand that, then it would have been okay, just to get an expansion of Christianity.
Of course, Paul, as you're talking about the expansion of Christianity, we know you're talking about the expansion, particularly, of Roman Catholicism. Of course, most of our listeners probably realize that as well. I just kind of want to make the distinction for those who maybe aren't. But anyways, we do have to break now for a commercial for both your and I's favorite magazine, The Barnes Review, and then we'll be back here in about 60 seconds. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Okay, so there's lots of other things that we see around our house at Christmas time. One thing is this idea of giving switches in coal. Well, that's interesting. You know, the hearth was always the center of all homes in ancient times. Today, they say we've replaced it with the television set, which gives light, right? And we gather around this much as we used to gather around the old fireplace. That being said, coal and switches were also used for starting fire. It's really coal and kindling wood. And so you think that perhaps this whole association with the hearth was just a very important part of where we should center our traditions. He comes through the chimney, this Santa Claus character. Why in the world would he come through the chimney when he could probably just open up a door and come in and get a lot? It'd be a lot easier to get that big sack of toys down there. But it all is part of the tradition, our ancient traditions of associating the hearth and the home and heat and light and also cooking food. And a very important part, and this is, of course, where Santa Claus does his thing. Why would he give you coal and switches? I'm not 100% sure why they give coal. Maybe just a kid would be particularly disappointed in coal, but also it ties back to the hearth and starting a fire and getting that child back to, if they've been ill-behaved, getting them back to a functioning member of the family. Yes, and so, you know, as we go through Europe, we also wonder how in the world we came up with the name Santa Claus. And, of course, back in the day, the people of Holland and the Dutch, the Netherlands, used to refer to him as Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas, Sinterklaas. And when lots of Dutch came over, and they came to the New York area, and we had a mixture of people speaking German and Dutch and English. And so the English kids were kind of very jealous because you remember Cromwell had outlawed Christmas celebrations, I believe in the 1600s. Not sure. You tell me when Cromwell was around and make sure I got that right.
I say it was in the 17th century. I can't remember the exact dates, but it was.
So they come over here, and these kids, their neighbor kids, if they're Dutch or whatever or German, they're getting presents at this time of year, and they hear and they listen and they hear who brought the gifts for you, and they'll say Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas, or Sinterklaas, both which turned into Santa Claus and Santy Claus, and so that's kind of where we got the name there. And of course, that's the Dutch, and I'm jumping all over the place, but this is going to tie into something that you're going to talk about later, which is Thomas Nast. But even before that was Clement Moore. I understand it wasn't Clement Moore, but a major who had written that story. But that being said, that's the night before Christmas, or a visit, I think it was a visit from St. Nicholas, in which suddenly this guy is flying through the sky, and he's landing in a sleigh drawn by 8 miniature reindeer. I have no idea where he came up with that idea, except to say once again that the reindeer are associated with the North and the Scandinavian countries, but also the North Pole area, where all of a sudden he's living nowadays with his toy factory. But how he became drawn by 8 tiny reindeer, I have no idea. But that being said, once again, it's definitely a tie to an area that is not. Obviously, we don't have reindeer running around in America, in the United States. That being said, he also is suddenly dressed like a Dutchman. He's got these big breeches on. He has a thick back belt. He's smoking his pipe. It's a clay pipe, right? He has a red cap with a ball on it and white fur. A lot of this is just a slow transition from the ecclesiastical garb of the bishop of, St. Nicholas, the bishop of Myra. We wonder how does he become a Dutchman? Well, the Dutch were just embrace these Christmas celebrations, and they really put their own twist on it, so to speak. But anyway, suddenly he's a Dutchman and has almost no resemblance whatsoever to our ancient bishop of Myra. Now, the other name that we call Santa Claus by is Kris Kringle. Kris Kringle is yet again another alteration of a Christian term by one who brings gifts. In many Catholic countries in Europe, Christkindl brings the gifts. That's the Christ child. The multiple languages basically is Christkindl. And so once the kids over here might have come across a family that was having the Christ child bring the gifts, and that Christkindl sounded like Kris Kringle, who brings the gifts, Christkindl. And so Kris Kringle is related to that. And as you go, political correctness will always rear its head. For many, many years in the Netherlands, and here's another strange tradition, again related to the goat, right, is that Santa Claus started to have assistants help him deliver the gifts. Might be Knecht Ruprecht. Knecht Ruprecht was an old-looking dude in baggy peasant clothes, we'll say, and he might be the one who has to dole out the lashes for the bad kids. And so he's going through the woods with Santa Claus. Sometimes, like Father Christmas and the other guys don't have a sleigh or anything. They're just walking through the woods. How the heck they're going to get all those presents delivered, I don't know. But in other countries, Austria and Germany, for instance, you have a very devil-like character who comes with Santa Claus. He's got a long tongue and horns and red skins, and his name is Krampus. And Krampus is more of a mountain kind of a tradition there. But the funny thing about Krampus is he looks just like the devil. And here's the devil's coming along with Santa Claus, and boy, kids would be awfully scared there. Now, here's an example of how things change and how secular concerns get involved into religious ones. The Dutch were concerned that perhaps this was a little bit overboard. Santa Claus shouldn't be hanging out with someone that looks just like the devil. He is always portrayed with horns and red skin and a little goatee and the whole thing. They sell Krampus cookies and everything else at Christmas time in Austria and Germany. So they thought, and people in the Netherlands thought, well, maybe he should be accompanied by somebody else. So we're going to have Black Peter come with Santa Claus. And we're getting rid of the devil. And so all of a sudden their kind of legends changed, and Santa Claus was being accompanied by Black Peter. Black Peter was a dark-skinned Moor. What they were telling the children there was that and by the way, they were well aware of the Moorish practice of enslaving Europeans all the way from Ireland to Iceland to the Dalmatian coast, all across, tens of thousands, if not millions, of Christians captured and taken into slavery by Moorish and Barbary pirates and such. But so they said, well, that'll be great. He's Black Peter. He's a kind of a dark-skinned guy, and he's pretty nice, and the kids love him over there now. But unfortunately, they didn't realize the reaction that you would get in the woke movement. Okay, so all of a sudden there's like, well, why is this black guy being enslaved by Santa Claus? Okay. Now, by the way, the kids were bad. Then this Moor would take him off to Spain, And by the way, he and Santa Claus vacationed together, evidently, even in the old legends. And so today, now, however, you have these people objecting to a dark-skinned individual being basically the slave of Santa Claus. Krampus was led around with a neck shackle and chain. He couldn't get away. Santa Claus did not want him to get away. So they did away with this chain, implying that Black Peter was Santa Claus' slave. But man, I was in the Netherlands a few years ago, and it is not politically correct. And so Black Peter is changing. Black Peter is going to have a rainbow-colored face or rainbow-colored hair. And he's not. And by the way, I find this to be so ridiculous. Black Peter is beloved by the children, the white children, and the blacks, but it's 95% over there. I think in Netherlands still are 90%. And it might have changed drastically in the last couple of years. But he's beloved. And here this black character is walking around the streets and he's singing and giving children candy. And they've ruined it for these kids. And it has nothing to do with that. And here's a chance for little white kids, if this is what they're worried about, Black Lives Matter and all this stuff, that they literally they walk on, they think that this guy walks on water, right? But anyway, the point is that's all changing now, and it's a rainbow. We know what that's a symbol of in this country. So quickly, things can change from political correctness. Now, we're back to the Santa Claus and Clement Moore, and it's not only it was Thomas Nast who kind of made him a Dutchman, but part of the descriptions of Santa Claus and Clement Moore's The Night Before Christmas also seem to portray him as kind of a Dutchman, but he has changed slightly since the 1860s. And again, multiple numbers of different types of Santa Clauses, from England to Spain to France to Italy. And again, some of these, the Christ child delivers the gifts. But how we got to the point now where, now I'm going to turn this discussion over to you, because suddenly somebody realized that Christmas is big money. I was going to say, by the way, when we were talking off air, I mentioned that one of the ancient Roman philosophers or something was describing the Kalends festival, which was a gift-giving festival, and how great it was for the merchants and how sales were way up and how they loved Kalend and gift-giving time, because the merchants would always know that they were going to make a ton of money selling little baubles to the Romans to give to their family members and their children and their friends and family, et cetera, et cetera. So now we get to Thomas Nast in the 1860s, and suddenly he becomes a massive marketing character.
Well, Thomas Nast, kind of what you were talking about, how all of a sudden Santa Claus was appearing as a Dutchman. You look at Thomas Nast's portrayal of Santa Claus in Harper's Weekly, and he looked like he looked like an elf. Looked like a little pot-bellied elf with a pipe, but you could see the Dutchman features, even in that. And
now those initial illustrations by Nast were done for what purpose?
Well, the best that I can tell is those illustrations actually began even before the 1870s. They actually began in the 1860s, and basically the way the legend was kind of working, or the way the Harper's Ferry or Harper's Weekly, articles were working there in the 1860s, is they were being distributed primarily in the North. But, copies of the magazine also made their way through the South as well during the war between the states. And, Santa Claus would bring children, or to all the Yankee children were good little boys and girls, and so they got Christmas presents. And they got fruit in their stocking and so forth. But all the Southern children were bad boys and girls, and so they got coal in their stocking. And so it was really a propaganda piece against the South and the children of the South, even. Kind of, I guess, maybe trying to impart to the children that if they're, that if they were Yankee children, they would be having a good Christmas, and if their parents were evil Southerners who were rebelling against the government, that their lives would be better and so forth. And, maybe even trying to make the children of the South discontent, in their position. But, why a magazine in New York would choose to propagandize, children during the war between the states, I have no idea, but obviously they did.
Well, now that brings up an interesting thing. Is the ultimate goal of our modern Christmas celebration designed to replace Jesus with this Santa Claus figure?
Well, I've wondered that. And, Nast, as best as I can tell, Nast claimed to be a Christian and perhaps was. So, I do not know that there was a, anti-Christian animosity on his part. But what I've wondered is because the next caricature, if you will, in the evolution of the image of Santa Claus was Harold Sundblom's Coca-Cola Santa Claus, which is really the Santa Claus that we're accustomed to seeing today.
Yes.
The fat man, the white beard, the red suit, all that stuff. And Sundblom is, and some people are just automatically going to jump to conclusions for the fact that I would even dare to utter these words. But a name like Sundblom to me sounds Jewish. And so I was wondering, was Santa Claus some type of, I don't want to say it was a Jewish conspiracy, because that would have required at that time, a whole bunch of Jewish people getting together and conspiring. But maybe even on the individual part, here was a Jewish individual who thought to himself, well, what, I can really throw a wrench into this big Christian holiday. And so I wondered if maybe Sundblom wasn't a Jewish person who was, desirous of, kind of launching a subtle attack there against Christmas with his whole Santa Claus campaign. I guess I'll have to speculate on that from now until I die, because, I can't really prove it. And, I've looked for the evidence. I don't really see it. That doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It just means that
well, keep watching TV, because what you got in these Coke commercials, right? Is Santa Claus taking a big vacation. He's got two girls with bikinis on either side of him. He certainly has changed his focus from the spiritual well-being of his flock to his own the hedonism.
Right.
And so, it won't be long before maybe Santa Claus in this new version someday in the future might be delivering crack and methamphetamine. Who knows? And he might look like an illegal immigrant. But I'm interested to see where this, and I don't have enough time left in this planet in 20 years maybe, but I'd love to see what happens to Santa Claus. And I know that they like him because he is secular. He is secular. He just happens to show up on the day. He could show up any time of the year. I guess it's the gift-giving tradition of Christmas that ties him in. But it doesn't, if we agree, and if you read some of the books that are published by the Barnes Review, that there's been a slow, methodical, and advancing agenda to weaken the foundations of Christianity, most assuredly taking, and I believe our most important holiday, of course, is Easter. But for most Christians and most Christian children in this increasingly secularized world, know Santa Claus before they know anything else. And that's a shame. Because it would seem to me to be part of well, let me put it this way: people that want to see Christianity weakened in this nation, which is a lot of people on the far left, right? Because Christianity is, of course, associated with oppression, and it was the religion of our horrible founding fathers, and all these others, and all the wars we've been into. Oh, Christians are just horrible, right? Well, so if you can slowly but surely edge Jesus out, and I've been watching what they're doing with Easter, you will find the occasional accurate portrayal of the life of Jesus, I suppose. But that's politically incorrect. Look at The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson and how it was come down upon as anti-Semitic. And, of course, after hundreds of years of doing the Passion play of Oberammergauer, right, I mean, it was a long tradition. They've sanitized that by removing what they think is anti-Semitic out of actual biblical scripture and a following of a play that had been going on by Christians for 300-400 years, I believe. It had gone on that long. So when you turn on and I've said this before, but when you turn on the television at Easter time, you will have a greater chance of finding a program on Passover or the Holocaust rather than the life of Jesus. So they've done what they can there to weaken that holiday as well. Again, I mean, I don't want to go there for this show, but much of our, to me, it's not a condemnation, but a testament to the versatility of Christianity, that a lot of our symbolism associated with Easter eggs, fertility, regeneration, a rabbit, right? Easter bunny, who was a very prolific breeder, right? And rebirth and regeneration. Springtime, once again, as we're talking about sometime around March 21. I know that Easter is a lunar assigned holiday. But again, all these traditions are so symbolic. But again, anything anybody can do, and you ought to read, let me finish my sentence, anything anybody can do to weaken the centralization of Jesus in the center of these two holidays is doing the devil's work, and is doing the work of those who want to see Christian faith diminished. And also, it's so weird. Here's Christmas, and we're all, and maybe you don't, I do. I run out and get gifts for everybody, right? I spend too much money in the whole thing. And the wrapping paper you get is, hey, religious today, right? It's got snowflakes on it. They don't even call it a Christmas vacation for the kids, right? It's just a winter holiday. So this has been going on and on and on. And I guess the ultimate goal is to have Santa Claus simply be the only person we recognize. And for all of our children, generations in the future, to completely forget that Jesus was in any way involved with this tale. So,
extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
I think you're right.
About Santa Claus replacing Jesus. In Iran, for example, they have a big Christmas parade every year. And, the president and, the other political leaders of Iran and even, some of the imams will march in this Christmas parade and they will appear with Santa Claus. And so Islam doesn't have a problem with Santa Claus, obviously, because,
I was going to make a point that we had in an article recently that in the Mamilla Massacre, which was a little-known massacre in the Holy Land carried out after the Persian Empire came and conquered the Holy Land region, they teamed up with the local Jews, who had quite a number of soldiers and such and forces and whatever, and to help the Muslims drive the Christians out. The Christians being accused of pogroms at the time. This is way back when. This is in the BC times, as far as I remember. Excuse me, hold on a second. That would be the Christians, so I'm completely incorrect. It was maybe I can't remember the day off the top of my head. I'll dig it up. But anyway, as the Persians came in and conquered the Holy Land, they said, okay, that's enough. Well, the Jews went crazy. They started slaughtering Christians. Some estimates are 80,000. And besides that, they tried to tear down our most sacred bastions of Christianity, the basilicas, whatever else they get their hands on, local shrines, things of any importance to Christians. And the Persians were like, these people have gone crazy. They're slaughtering everybody in town. They're getting ready to tear down the Church of the Nativity over here. And the Persians said, oh, no, we're not going to let them do that, because in there was a mosaic of the three wise men dressed in their Phrygian caps and other Persian garb, bringing gifts to the Christ child. And the Persians weren't quite sure who they were, but they knew one thing. They were rich Persians and most likely Persian kings. And so they stopped the slaughter. So, and people forget how much in the ancient areas of the Holy Land where Christianity was born, they've been living side by side for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that, for instance, Alawite Muslims, right? Bashir al-Assad is a Alawite. That they will actually, the Muslims will actually go to some of the patron saint churches or shrines, and they will worship, say, to have a baby, and they'll go to a Christian saint that other Christians go to. So there was quite a bit of overlap there. I feel like, also the way that the Iranians, Christianity and Judaism are both legal, and let you practice. I think you have to pay a heavy tax. I don't, I'm not 100% sure what their law is, but there's always been a willingness that there's a relationship there, and that we have, before the advent of political Zionism, and probably after the Crusades, the people of the Mideast actually got along okay.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. I'm going to cut the conversation there because we're going to go into some more detail that we don't have time for in today's episode of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. But there is always next week, and so next week we'll continue this conversation that Paul and I are having on Christmas and Christmas traditions. And we'll pick up right here where we left off, and we'll be talking about, basically how things began to be destroyed in the Middle East after around 600 AD, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. And of course, the effects that that had on Christmas tradition and Christmas celebration and so forth. But I do hope that your gift giving is progressed by now. Mine is done. But that said, you do have about, I would say, 11 shopping days for Christmas, if you include Christmas Eve. So you have just a few days left to do your Christmas shopping. And one place I would like to point you to, if you've not already been there, is the Barnes Review website, barnesreview.org. Go to the bookstore, and we have some great books in there that make great Christmas gifts. You say, well, the people I'm shopping for, they maybe don't read so much. We have some great DVDs too, and a lot of the information that's available in the books is also available in a DVD, and maybe they'd rather sit and watch a DVD than read a book. We get that, which is why we have both things available there. Just some great gifts. We also have some other little gifts that are available in there. Confederate flags are available there. Some little desktop sets, some other things that would make great Christmas gifts. I'd also like to point you to my website, www.dixieheritage.net. Have some books and some DVDs that are available as well that would make great Christmas gifts. If you can get your orders in to either website, I would say by about the 17th or 18th of December, we should be able to get them to you in time for Christmas. I don't want to make that a hard and fast guarantee, just because you never know what the Postal Service might do. But in all practicality, if we can get stuff out in the mail by, say, the 18th for you, Lord willing, you should have it by Christmas Eve, because the Postal Service is going to be delivering all the way through the 24th of December this year. Another thing I'd like to do is I'd like to remind you that next year we're going to have a new program here on TBR Radio, and it's going to be called the Barnes Review Radio Hour. And we're going to be talking very specifically about the things that are appearing in the Barnes Review magazine, and about subjects of history that are related to that and so forth. And what makes that great for our listeners here on the Dixie Heritage Show is that the Dixie Heritage Show will continue to be broadcast on TBR Radio next year. So we'll have two shows instead of one. And the Dixie Heritage Show will be all Southern all the time, all history all the time, all war between the states all the time, and so forth. And so some of the other subjects that we've been covering here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour that you say maybe they aren't quite so Southern related, they'll go to the new show. And the Dixie Heritage Show will be all Southern all the time. What I'd like to do is, I know that we have some guests lined up already for both shows, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to reach out to our listening audience as the year comes to an end, and I'd like to ask you, would you have liked to have been on this radio show? And if that's the case, I want you to reach out to me by email, and go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net, and use the contact form, and reach out to me by email. And just say, hey, Dr. Ed, I'd love to be on one of your radio shows, and, just tell me what you got going on. Maybe you want to talk about your Confederate ancestor. Maybe you've written a book. Maybe there's something that, you say, I'd like you to talk to me about it, like you're an expert on a certain subject or whatever, and we can do a radio interview. And I think that would be a great thing. So please reach out to me, and maybe we could set that up. I would also like to say that there's a strong possibility that we may be moving within the next few weeks. And a cross-country move is quite a daunting task. If you're up in Maryland, especially on the eastern shore of Maryland or Virginia, I'd like for you to reach out to me as well. And we may be moving up to that area, relocating up there, moving our studios and our offices and everything up there. And if we do, that's going to be a daunting task. And we like to have some friends when we get there, so reach out to us. At any rate, we are running out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. So I am going to leave you until next week. And Lord willing, we'll be back. Until then, God bless.